In this episode, we're going to take what you learned about vendor risk and due diligence and turn it into something that actually changes behavior: contract language. For many beginners, contracts feel like a legal black box that privacy teams are allowed to glance at but not truly shape. In practice, privacy management has a real role here because the contract is where expectations become enforceable, and enforceable expectations are what create accountability when the vendor relationship gets stressful. The goal is not to turn you into a lawyer, and it is not to memorize a set of magic phrases. The goal is to understand what privacy clauses are trying to accomplish, how to draft them so they match operational reality, and how to negotiate them without losing the core protections. If you can connect risks to specific clauses and explain why each one matters, you can improve contracts even when you are not the final signer. That is a major step toward a privacy program that is strong in daily operations, not just impressive on paper. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to frame contract work is to remember that a privacy clause is a control, and controls should map to real risks. If you worry about unauthorized access, you need clauses about access restriction, confidentiality, logging, and least privilege. If you worry about secondary use, you need clauses about purpose limitation, prohibition of selling or sharing beyond the service, and restrictions on combining data. If you worry about cross-border access, you need clauses that define data location, limit remote access, and require notice or approval for changes. If you worry about inability to meet deletion obligations, you need clear deletion timelines, deletion scope, and the vendor's duty to provide confirmation. The risk mapping matters because it prevents contract language from becoming a generic template that looks protective but fails in real situations. Vendors tend to accept generic language more easily, but generic language is also where loopholes hide. Strong privacy management is not about adding more clauses. It is about adding the right clauses and insisting they mean something in practice. One of the most fundamental clauses is role clarity, because confusion about roles causes the worst operational breakdowns. Contracts should clearly describe whether the vendor is processing data only on your instructions, whether it has any independent discretion, and what that discretion covers. Even if you do not use legal role names in conversation, the contract needs a clear statement of what the vendor may do and what it may not do. This matters for daily operations, because the vendor's internal teams will use the contract as a reference when making decisions. If the contract is vague, the vendor may default to what is easiest or most profitable, like using data for improvement or keeping it longer for analytics. Role clarity also supports accountability because it makes it easier to determine responsibility when something goes wrong. When everyone knows the boundaries, disagreements become rarer and incident response becomes faster. Purpose limitation is another central clause, and it should be written with enough detail that the vendor cannot stretch it. A weak clause says the vendor will use data to provide services, which sounds fine until you realize services can be interpreted broadly. A stronger approach defines the service purpose and explicitly prohibits uses outside that purpose unless you provide written authorization. It can also clarify whether limited uses like troubleshooting, security monitoring, and fraud prevention are allowed as part of providing the service, because those often are legitimate but should still be bounded. This is also where you can restrict model training, benchmarking, advertising, or product development that relies on customer data. Negotiation often happens here because vendors want flexibility, but your job is to make sure flexibility does not quietly become secondary use that conflicts with your commitments to individuals. When you negotiate, focus on explaining that purpose limitation is about trust and predictability, not about accusing the vendor of bad intent. Data minimization and data field control clauses help you reduce risk by limiting what data the vendor receives in the first place. The contract can require that the vendor collect and process only the data necessary for the defined purpose, and that any changes to required data fields must be communicated and approved. This matters because services tend to grow over time, and new features often ask for more data than is truly needed. If you allow that drift without control, the vendor relationship becomes riskier every year. A minimization clause can also require the vendor to support configuration that disables optional tracking or limits collection, which makes privacy protections more practical. Negotiation here is often easier because vendors can agree in principle, but you should still tie it to operational change control. The key is to prevent surprise expansion of processing, because surprise expansion is what turns a stable contract into an unexpected compliance problem. Confidentiality and access control clauses are where privacy and security overlap, and they should be drafted in a way that supports real access governance. A useful clause requires the vendor to ensure that personnel with access are authorized, trained, and bound by confidentiality obligations. It can also require role-based access control, separation of duties for high-risk actions, and procedures for granting and revoking access quickly when roles change. Logging and monitoring language is important too, because you cannot investigate what you cannot see. You want the vendor to log access to personal data and to retain logs for a reasonable period, while also protecting logs from tampering. In negotiation, vendors sometimes push back on detailed access requirements, especially if their platform is standardized. When that happens, the privacy manager's job is to focus on outcomes, restricted access, documented processes, and the ability to investigate misuse. If a vendor truly cannot meet those outcomes, that is a vendor selection issue, not a wording issue. Subprocessor clauses are essential because they control how the vendor extends the relationship to other parties. A strong clause requires the vendor to disclose subprocessors, obtain approval before adding new ones, and impose the same privacy and security obligations on them. It also requires the vendor to remain responsible for the subprocessor's performance, so you are not forced to negotiate separately with unknown companies. Many vendors will offer a notice-based approach instead of approval, where they notify you of changes and you can object. That can be workable if the notice period is reasonable and if your organization has a process to review and respond. Negotiation tends to revolve around how much control you get and how much operational flexibility the vendor keeps. The privacy manager should anchor the discussion in real risk. New subprocessors can change data location, create new access pathways, and introduce new breach exposure. If the vendor wants flexibility, it should also provide transparency and the ability for you to make an informed decision. Incident response and breach notification clauses are often the first thing people look for, but the details matter more than the existence. A weak clause says the vendor will notify you promptly, which is meaningless when you are trying to meet specific deadlines and make real decisions. A stronger clause defines a timeline for notification after discovery, requires specific information to be provided, and requires ongoing updates as facts evolve. It should also require cooperation, such as preserving evidence, participating in investigations, and supporting communications to regulators or affected individuals when needed. Another useful element is requiring the vendor to have an incident response plan and to test it periodically. Vendors may resist strict notification timelines because investigations are messy, but you can negotiate by separating initial notification from full details. The point is to avoid the worst-case scenario where you learn about an incident too late to act responsibly. Audit rights and assurance clauses are where you create visibility and leverage, especially for higher-risk vendors. These clauses can include the right to receive independent assurance reports, the right to ask reasonable questions, and in some cases the right to conduct audits or assessments. Vendors often resist direct audits because they have many customers and cannot host everyone, so negotiation often lands on standardized reports and questionnaires. That can be fine if the reports are meaningful and current, and if you can ask follow-up questions. The privacy manager should focus on the ability to verify controls, not on the drama of an on-site audit. If a vendor refuses all forms of evidence and insists on trust alone, that is a maturity signal and a risk signal. Accountability requires verifiability, because without it you cannot prove to your own leadership that the risk is being managed. Data retention and deletion clauses are critical because retention creep is one of the most common sources of privacy trouble. The contract should specify that the vendor will retain personal data only as long as necessary for the defined purpose and will delete or return data at the end of the service. It should also define what deletion means in practice. whether it applies to primary systems, backups, logs, and derived datasets. Some vendors cannot delete from backups immediately, so the clause might include a time-bound backup rotation and restrictions on access to backups. You also want a clause that requires confirmation of deletion, such as an attestation or a status report, because you need evidence for accountability. Negotiation here often involves balancing technical reality with privacy expectations. The privacy manager's job is to avoid accepting vague promises like "we delete eventually," and to ensure that whatever is agreed can be tracked and defended. Cross-border transfer and data location clauses are often some of the most sensitive to negotiate because they can affect how the vendor runs its global operations. Still, if your organization has transfer constraints, you need contract language that reflects them. That might include commitments to host data in specific regions, to limit remote access from outside those regions, and to notify you before changes that could affect data location. It might also include requirements for specific transfer safeguards and cooperation in producing documentation about transfers. Vendors may offer broad statements about compliance, but you want operational commitments tied to the service you are buying. The privacy manager should keep the conversation grounded in operational accuracy, like where data is stored, who can access it, and how disaster recovery works. A contract that claims data stays in one region while support access occurs globally is a mismatch, and mismatches are what regulators and auditors notice. Negotiation is where many privacy teams get stuck, so it helps to have a simple strategy that keeps you calm. First, prioritize clauses by risk impact, because you will not win everything, and you should not spend your limited negotiating power on low-value wording changes. Second, explain the business reason for each clause in plain language, like "we need this to meet our obligations to individuals and to respond quickly if something happens." Third, offer alternatives that preserve the outcome even if the vendor cannot accept your exact wording, such as using a standard assurance report instead of a custom audit. Fourth, be clear about what is a deal breaker versus what is a preference, because ambiguity wastes time and leads to late-stage conflict. The goal is not to punish the vendor. It is to create a relationship that can survive stress without turning into a crisis. When you negotiate with outcomes in mind, you become more effective and less dependent on a single template. To wrap it up, drafting and negotiating privacy clauses is really about converting privacy risk into enforceable, testable commitments that align behavior across organizations. Role clarity and purpose limitation define the boundaries of processing so secondary use and drift are controlled. Confidentiality, access controls, and logging make misuse harder and investigations possible. Subprocessor, transfer, and location clauses protect you from hidden expansion and cross-border surprises. Incident response, assurance, retention, and deletion clauses ensure you can meet your own obligations with evidence when the relationship is tested. The strongest contracts are not the longest ones, but the ones that match operational reality and create clear accountability. When you can connect a clause to a risk and describe how it will work day to day, you're doing the job of privacy management in a way that actually reduces harm and strengthens trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.